Hello everyone, welcome back to Desker's YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be talking about MVPs, minimum viable products. Building something new, something you believe in is exhilarating. It's a feeling, a rush like no other. And that's why a lot of us join product management. But building something only for that feeling is not something that a lot of us can afford. Like I said before, a lot of times there'll always be more things that you want to do than the resources you have. One way of managing that is prioritizing your work. And an extension of that concept of prioritization is the idea of minimum viable product. MVP is all about prioritizing what you need to build to test if it's worth investing in. So what is an MVP? The concept of MVP was originally developed by Eric Ries. According to him, a minimum viable product is that version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning with the least amount of effort. MVP can mean a lot of different things for different organizations. Sometimes what people call MVP isn't really an MVP. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In layman's term, an MVP is building the most basic version of your product with only the core functionality, the key differentiator, without all the bells and whistles. Before we talk more about MVP, let's talk about a lot of other things that MVP is generally confused with, like POC, prototype, MMP. That's a lot of different things, right? So let's talk about each of them. What is a POC? POC is a proof of concept. The goal of a POC is to find out if it is possible to build out the idea into an actual product with the technology available. POC is helpful if you're innovating and trying to do something that has not been done before. A POC doesn't even need to have a UI. As long as you can prove the technical feasibility using your dev console, it's enough. And that doesn't sound like an MVP, does it? It's not, but it's often confused with an MVP. What is a prototype? A prototype tells you how the user will interact with the product. It defines the flow of various elements and how the user will use them to solve their problems. Again, this is not MVP. It doesn't sound like MVP, but a lot of times a prototype is confused with an MVP. MMP. Now that sounds a little bit closer to MVP, right? No, it's called a minimum marketable product. It is the smallest version of the product that users will buy. It is a stripped down, no frills, stable version of the product that has enough value in it to be sold. And MMP is the result of multiple iterations of an MVP. In essence, if you think about it, all these are different stages in the evolution of a product. For example, POC seems like the first one where you're trying to figure out, okay, this idea, is this even technically possible with all the technology that is available right now in the world? Then comes the next stage, which is like prototyping, where you're trying to figure out, okay, we figured out that it is possible to build it technically. Now, how do we feel that users will interact with it? The next stage is your actual MVP, where you try to get feedback from the users on the product that you build. And finally comes the MMP, which is the final iteration of your MVP and is converted into something that can be marketed to the users and they're going to buy it. The thing is, it's very easy to understand the definition of MVP, but when it comes down to actually implementing an MVP, that's when people start to get confused. A good way to do it is for you and your team to ask yourself the following questions when you're looking at your proposed MVP. Number one, does this solve the problem which is its focus, the reason why you're building out this product? Number two, can you cut down the scope of it further without impacting the solution? Number three, have you cut down the scope so much that now the product is just bare bone and doesn't really solve the problem? The intention behind these questions is to find that right balance between the three variables that make up an MVP. Number one is the resource. You don't want to invest too much on a product at this stage. Number two is time. You want to deliver quickly and iterate faster. Number three, value. The key value proposition of the product should come through in your MVP. Is the goal to get it right with the first MVP? Absolutely not. The primary goal of an MVP is to help your team learn whether your idea appeals to customers. The first version of your product that customers buy will most likely not be the first version of the MVP that you build. An MVP doesn't just end with one release. It follows a cycle driven by real data from real customers or users who work and use the MVP. This cycle, also known as the build, measure, learn cycle, is something that you'll have to keep repeating X number of times before you can find the MVP that works. So let's try and understand the build, measure, learn cycle. The first step is build. You build the most basic version of the product you think will work. It's important to note here, it's you think. You think here is your hypothesis, your gut, based on the research you've done or the experience you've had. Make sure that you add relevant tracking to your product so that you can proactively track metrics instead of it being an afterthought. Number two, measure. Be clear about what do you want to measure, why do you want to measure it, and how will you measure it. I cannot stress enough on the part how. The fact that it needs to be part of your build phase. You shouldn't be in a situation where your MVP has been out for 3 or 4 weeks before you decide to track important metrics, because then all that time and resources has been wasted. Besides quantitative measurements, you can also gauge the success of your MVP through some qualitative feedback. You can do customer interviews, you can do feedback forums, you can do focus groups, as well as analyze recordings of user interaction with your product. The last part of the build, measure, learn cycle is the learning. Your MVP has been out for a few weeks now. You've got the data and you've been speaking to your customers. Now, how are you going to decipher the result? See if you're able to find answers to the following questions when you look at your data. Who is using the product? Is this the user you're targeting, or is this the intended user? How often are they using the product? How many users are coming in through referrals? What does the feedback suggest? Did the MVP miss anything that is important to majority of the users? Based on the answers to the above questions, you know what to do next. And there are multiple possibilities. There are lots of different things that you might learn from this. For example, you might learn that users don't think the problem is worth solving. You're not getting enough users. Users don't understand how the problem is being solved by this product. So you have some work there to do. Users have different expectations from when they came in and checked out the product versus what they heard in the marketing material. So there's some gaps in your communication. Not enough people are using the product. Yes, that happens a lot of times as well. That means there's not enough demand, or you're doing something wrong. Or you need to build some additional capabilities and fix bugs and test the MVP again. Step 1, you have to develop your hypothesis. You might have it all figured out in your head, but it's important to sit down and write it. For example, your hypothesis might say, if we provide users X, then Y will happen. Take the time out to define X. Do your market research, talk to customers, talk to your teams to see if the hypothesis seems plausible. Look at any historical data in your company or outside that can help you come up with a realistic Y. Step number 2, identify your target users. The long-term vision for your product might be to reach millions of users. But for an MVP, it is important to focus on the early adopters. These are people who are more likely and open to try out new things and pave the way, as well as influence others to try it out in the future. Step number 3, gauge the market opportunity. Does the market opportunity align with your business goals? Look at what exists in the market today. Are there alternatives, substitutes in the market that solve the same problem? If yes, then do a deep dive into what they offer and how does your product differentiate from the competition. Step number 4, evaluate the technical feasibility. During the MVP stage, an important thing to consider is whether do you really need to build the entire product out from ground up. If there's a way for you to buy the underlying technology or partner with someone, then that is great. It will help you focus all your resources on the key differentiator for your product, which is the most important thing to do at this stage. For example, if your MVP requires you to send notifications to users, should you build that capability from scratch? No, absolutely not unless that is your key differentiator. Use a third party. There are lots of them out there who know how to do it and it's their key differentiator. Step number 5, build, measure, learn. Iterate using the build, measure, learn framework to develop an MVP that gives you user validation that you're looking for. Building an MVP has a lot of different advantages. An MVP will help you test your hypothesis in an efficient manner. It forces you to take a long-term vision of what your product needs to do and filter it down to its core competency, which is at the center of its existence. Through an MVP, you will save resources by building only what's necessary. You will move fast. You will fail fast. You will reduce the time to market. You will get real-world data on users' behavior, and you will learn and build the next version of your MVP. There are definitely challenges with MVP too. MVPs are tough, really tough to get right. What's tougher is to stomach what you learn from the MVP, because sometimes the MVP will tell you that your idea is not worth investing in. Sorry guys. And that can be tough thing to hear, even for a battle-hardened product management professional like yourself. The 2 mistakes you should definitely avoid while building out your MVP. The first is cutting the feature scope way too much to get out of the minimum. This generally happens when you're staring at the possibility of missing your deadline to release the MVP, or the development team is stretched with other competing priorities, or you have a shoestring budget to build your MVP. Please try to avoid it. The other mistake to avoid is you shouldn't forget that MVPs are MVPs. They're minimum viable. They aren't as polished as well-established products, right? We all look at MVP definitions and collectively nod our head in agreement in the initial stages. But when it actually comes down to go ahead and release it, we tend to forget that it's not the final product. It's just a test. We start nitpicking on how things should work, how features should be, and then the MVP doesn't go out the door. We get stuck. We get so stuck on focusing on things that don't matter at this stage. So don't make these 2 mistakes. Avoid them. The reality is that in your company, you might not be able to get resources to run your MVP, to do the build, measure, learn cycle. A lot of companies either don't have resources, don't have the foresight, the risk appetite, lots of reasons why they don't want to do MVP. But there are some alternatives to MVPs that you could probably look at. And some of you might not like what I'm going to tell you, but for people who don't have resources, this might be a way to get more validation from the market. Number 1 is product design. You can create high fidelity screens and stitch them together to convey how the user experience would look like. This method requires zero development, which is a lot of time the biggest bottleneck. Now use that flow that you have created and get feedback from users to gauge their interest. Sounds like a good idea. Try it out. Another thing you can do is come up with a product introduction video. You talk through what your product will do. Talk about the problem you will solve, what benefit it will have, and how it will work. See if it results in any traction from users. Number 3 is online ads. Create a compelling online ad. Do your keyword research to find which ones resonate the most with your users. Develop at least a few different versions of the ad. Find out the platform, whether it's Google, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, where your target users go, and use that platform to run ads for a few days. Obviously, make sure that you look at the cost per click and everything is in your budget. Analyze the traffic you get and find out what the demand for the product looks like. Use it to decide if this MVP is worth investing in. And finally, landing pages. It is very easy to create landing pages, compelling landing pages these days. Unbounce is a great tool. Create a coming soon page for your product. Ask users to share their contact information if they would like to be one of the first ones to get their hands on when it's ready. Create excitement about it. Share the page on relevant social media channels, forums to get traffic on the page. If you have some budget, then create online ads like we discussed. See if you're able to get a sense of what the demand for such a product or a service looks like. I hope this information will help you guys build out your MVP. Best of luck. Like I've said before, MVPs are tough to get right. And sometimes the feedback that you get from MVP, especially when it's your idea, is difficult to stomach. But keep at it. Listen to your users. Listen to what they're saying. And the MVP will help you build a really successful product. Thank you guys. On the way out, if you can subscribe to our channel, that'd be great. Thank you.